Hi, this is Caitlin, and I'm going to be talking about the theoretical connections within our seminal text, Ways with Words by Shirley Bryce Heath. And we're going to start at the beginning with the behaviorism that is found within the two communities of Rhodeville and Tracton and the way that the children in those two communities learn language. It definitely fits the idea that learning is a passive process. It just happens. You can't force it. It just is and it happens. And the children in Tracton and Rhodeville are not directly taught the ways with words of their communities. Rather, they learn by listening and by mimicking what is around them, their parents' speech and their siblings' speech and what they see and hear other adults and other community members doing. There is definitely evident in the training that happens in behaviorism, the specified behaviors and the conditioning of them. Parents in Rhodeville, for example, train their children to fit in with their community expectations. The children in Rhodeville are taught to tell the truth with all the facts correct about themselves. There's no make-believe until school starts. There's a lot of conditioning that goes on in Rhodeville. The parents, the current adults, when Ms. Heath was doing this study, mentioned that when they were learning language, they were taught to say the right thing. I'm sorry, yes ma'am, no sir, thank you and please. And it didn't really matter what the circumstance was, you said the right thing, which is definitely an example of behaviorism and of operant and classical conditioning as well in different ways. The second theory that we will look at is schema theory. The children in Tracton and Rhodeville learn how to communicate by building schemata based on what they're hearing and seeing happening with language in their community, which scaffolds their learning and their ways of engaging with the world. They listen to their parents and their grandparents and community members as they communicate with each other, and that's how they build their understanding of the world. The worlds, even in Rhodeville and Tracton, are vastly different. These children are growing up, even though they live just a few miles from each other, in completely different worlds, essentially. And so they're building their understanding of that world based on what they hear and see and the schemata that they're able to acquire from the others around them. In Tracton, for example, children begin to speak exactly as their parents do. It is not uncommon to hear small children begging and teasing and arguing with adults and cussing at each other and bossing people around. They often begin to repeat the ends of what they hear adults say, and then they add those into their own context. They see the same situation that their parent was talking about, and they take their parents' words and put it into their childhood context. And in Rhodeville, there's a quote from the text that says that the adults believe that if they teach children to pay attention, to listen, and to behave, the children not only learn how to talk, but how to learn. And I think this also goes back to the behaviorism that I mentioned, that they teach their children how to do these three things, how to pay attention and how to listen. And then the children build that schemata, and that's how they learn how to talk. It's not a direct intentional process. It just happens based on the schema that they have acquired. The next theory that we will look at is sociocultural historical theory. So we're taking a leap here from correspondence theories and cognitive constructivism into social constructivism, which is where a lot of this, the bulk of this text, I believe, lives within these social constructivist theories. Sociocultural historical theory specifically emphasizes social interaction as a scaffold or mediator for generating meaning within texts. Parents in Rhodeville constantly talk to their babies. They ask them questions of differing purposes, some that require no answer and some that require a specific answer. And children in Rhodeville are looked at as information gatherers and information givers. This is not necessarily the case in Tracton, but the children in Rhodeville learn through some participatory appropriation. They are apprentices of language, for example. And the children in Tracton, and especially the girls with this particular example, they build their language and learning into their play songs and hand claps. They're counting in them and naming body parts in them and making rhymes that don't necessarily make sense, but it's building their language based on things that they've heard. Everybody has funds of knowledge, and the Rhodeville Children's funds of knowledge are vastly different from that in Tracton, which is vastly different from those children who are in Maintown, the children of the townspeople, the richer suburban families. The mainstream culture funds of knowledge, the ones that are generally found within the classroom, align more closely to that of the children in Maintown than that of the children in Tracton and Rhodeville. But that doesn't mean that they don't have the funds of knowledge. They're just different. The next theory we'll look at is sociolinguistic theory, which is the focus on how people use their language in different social and cultural contexts. The Tracton children are expected to recognize that the same form of language or anything else is not expected to carry the same meaning at all times. There is a parent quoted in the text, and I'm not going to read it as she says it because it's quite difficult to understand, but she points out that the children, what they see one time, they have to take what they learned the time before, and it might be the same thing the next time, and it might not be the same thing the next time. They're expected to learn how to know when meanings are not literal, but figurative, and they're not taught it, they're just expected to learn it. The children in Maintown, which is the suburban area that's discussed in Chapter 7, engaged in literacy practices at home that most closely align with traditional school practices, which I will discuss a little bit on my last slide here. But the important thing to note is that the cultural differences that within the three towns are not reflections of their ability or lack of ability, or even the differing parental styles. Instead, these differences are reflections of the community's norms and expectations and how these children have become successful participants within their communities. They've all learned the ways to use words and to exist with words within their context. And it's only when we bring all those contexts and those children from three very different contexts together that the differences are as evident as they are. As it says, yes, reflections of community expectations and a child's success in becoming a participant of said community. And this is where I think Heath's work is so important, because as educators, and even myself, I've had this experience, we tend to see differences from the mainstream as deficits. But instead, how we should be looking at it is, how are these deficits rather strengths? And Heath suggests that teachers do home visits and take the time to learn about their community practices of literacy and what reading and speaking and writing looks like within the different homes, and then use that as a foundation to help support the children to fit into the broader mainstream culture as a whole. The next theory that we're going to look at is emergent literacy theory, which suggests that literacy development is natural and is shaped as individuals engage in their social worlds, which fits with a lot of the things that I've brought up at different points with different theories that we've been looking at. The children in Tracton and Rodeville, however, do not receive the same approximations of what we would call conventional literacy practices as do the children in Maintown, where they tend to get their literacy experiences more aligned with what we see in schools. They're read books by parents and teachers at Sunday school and at the YMCA and at the library, and they look at how to hold books, and they receive examples of fluent reading and learn how to name things and retrieve the different information from books and other texts, which is not necessarily what the children in Tracton and Rodeville receive. But they also get almost all of their literacy learning from social interaction with adults, which is a big part of emergency literacy theory as well. Speaking, reading, and writing are highly linked among parents and children in Maintown. The children learn which texts to interpret literally and which to interpret figuratively, and they come to act like literates before they actually learn how to read, which isn't necessarily the same way in Rodeville and Tracton. However, the children in Tracton and Rodeville, maybe not with written texts, but with spoken texts, learn when to take things literally and when to interpret them figuratively. And the last theory that we will look at, or theoretical frame, is that of the New Literacy Studies, which is important because Ways with Words is considered seminal within this. So the whole concept of New Literacy Studies, which came out of linguistic anthropology, is kind of built on Heath's work, or at least part of it is built on Heath's work, the way I understand it. And within NLS, the literacy practices are situated in local contexts and are purposeful, and they're tied to specific social goals, and that practices change as contexts and tools change. And we've discussed that, or I've discussed that at different points, where the children in these communities learn the difference between when to use certain types of language, what is, quote, right according to the parents in Rodeville, and when it is meant to be literal and when it is meant to be figurative. Scholars within New Literacy Studies explore the relationships between the local or community practices and the global, more mainstream practices. And the children in Tracton and Rodeville are proficient, very proficient in their local discourses, the small d discourses, while the children in Maintown are proficient in both the local and the global, the school context discourses. And I think that that is perhaps the most important thing that we can learn from this text, is that being proficient in one and not the other isn't a bad thing. It's just a different way of existing, and that our job as literacy professionals is to help those who are not as proficient within the global realm of discourse to develop that proficiency. And that is what we have for the theoretical lens on Ways with Words.